Now we are going into details of the regulation, and we are pleased to have here as a speaker Alexandra Turtelars from the European Commission. Alessandra joined the European Commission 10 years ago, almost since 10 years ago, and since June 2018, she's at the DG Santé as policy coordinator in the unit Farm to Fork strategy. And within her task, she's also responsible for the implementation of the new transparency regulation. So now she's really introducing us this important part of the regulation, which is the transparency regulation. So, Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chiara, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation at this very important event today. It's a pity that it's an online event and not in Parma itself, which would have been even nicer, but okay, that's it also allows to have more people probably online. As indeed in my introduction was said, I'm in the Farm to Fork strategy, and in this unit we cover the General Food Law, which is the founding regulation of EFSA, which has been amended with the Transparency Regulation, the subject of my presentation. And in general, my unit also is responsible for coordination between Santé and EFSA on a more horizontal level, and we then coordinate and work together closely with our other technical units, of which, for example, TACIS covers then the novel foods in his unit. So I would like to start with some introductory words to tell you a little bit about the history, how this new transparency regulation has come up. So the full title of the regulation is actually is a regulation on the transparency and sustainability of the EU risk assessment in the food chain. And we always abbreviate this to the transparency regulation. And in our internal documents, we just say TR, but that's a jargon, so I will try to avoid that. So this new transparency regulation entered into application in March 2021. So in regulatory terms, this is still, we call it new, it's quite recent. And this regulation has considerably changed the work of both EU risk managers and also the risk assessor, in this case, EFSA as EU risk assessor. And it changed the work in many ways, and I will address this in my presentation. I would also, as an introduction, like to mention that the transparency regulation applies to all areas covered by the General Food Law, by the food chain, for which EFSA will be asked for scientific output, including risk assessments of regulated products. And in this presentation, I will give you an overview of the main features of the regulation and its main provisions. But before I enter into the technical details, please allow me to say a few words on the historical background on how this new regulation emerged. So the General Food Law regulation, which also TACIS mentioned already quite extensively in his presentation, is the cornerstone of the EU food safety system. It is the founding regulation of EFSA, and it was adopted in 2002, which is now exactly 20 years ago. And EFSA, and we are all celebrating actually the 20 years anniversary of the General Food Law. But after many years of application of the General Food Law, and in the framework of the better regulation principles to which the Commission adheres, we decided to carry out a so-called fitness check of this evaluation, which is a comprehensive evidence-based policy evaluation. And the objective of this fitness check was precisely to assess whether the EU General Food Law was still fit for purpose and whether it still reflected the current policy trends, and also taking into account certain developments at union and at international level. So the results of this fitness check were actually published early 2018, and they showed in general that the General Food Law was still fit for purpose. So this was very, very good news. And it also concluded that the EU food safety system works well. So this was all very positive. No systemic deficiencies had been identified. it showed that EFSA in particular had improved the use of the science underpinning policymaking in the European Union, and also improved the transparency of the EU measures taken. And as Takis also mentioned, our food safety system in the European Union it has been used even as a model for other regulators across the world, and precisely for the high levels of safety that it provides and delivers, which is underpinned by the best science available. And this also was used as an enabling factor to facilitate international trade. However, the fitness check identified certain opportunities for the fine-tuning of the legislative framework. There are always things that can be improved. And that was taking into account the existing challenges and societal needs. So despite the high level of protection of human health and consumers' interest, the sensitivity over food safety and over the food chain always remains very high in Europe. And there were expectations for transparency and also reliability. And these expectations, they legitimately grew exponentially over recent years. And in that respect, and in the context of regulated products, the civil society and also members of the European Parliament called for even more transparency and independence in the EU risk assessment process. In addition, it was identified that EFSA's scientific excellence capacity has to be ensured also in the long term. Frank explained very well in the previous presentation how EFSA model is working with experts, with panels and so on. But it's always difficult to find new good experts around Europe to fill the panels and to keep them interested to participate. And in the end, it was suggested that the member states should also be more involved in this issue to increase and to ensure scientific excellence capacity. And finally, also risk communication was recognized as a key tool for dialogue between risk assessors and risk managers, but also with stakeholders and the general public. But this risk communication in the past had not always been effective enough. So then in autumn 2017, while the fitness check was actually being finalized, the reauthorization of a widely used herbicide, glyphosate, I'm sure you have heard about it, was a subject of a very successful European citizen initiative calling for a ban on glyphosate. The European Citizens Initiatives are a tool for the civil society and the public to raise a certain issue. And if more than 1 million signatories for a certain European citizen initiative are collected, then the European Commission has to take action. So this ECI calling for a ban on glyphosate was successful, and it also highlighted the societal expectations for strengthened risk assessment. So the ECI called for more transparency in scientific assessment, and especially with respect to scientific studies that are supporting the risk assessment. And they also called for a need to further ensure the quality and independence of those scientific studies. So in reply to the European Citizen Initiative, the European Commission gave a firm commitment already in December 2017 to come forward with a legislative proposal. And this proposal was actually the transparency regulation. And the proposal was published in April 2018. The proposal was then negotiated with the European Parliament and the European Council, and that actually happened quite in a record time, within 10 months. So the proposal was published in April 2018, and in February 2019, we reached an agreement between the Parliament and the Council. And the proposal was then adopted in June 2019 and published in the official journal of the European Union in September 2019. So for regulatory processes, we think that this all went very fast. The transparency regulation actually is a targeted revision of the general food law itself, but also 8 sectorial acts. And these include the GMO directive, genetically modified food and feed regulation, the regulation on smoke flavorings, feed additives, food contact materials, food additives, enzymes and flavorings, plant protection products, and novel food. But the impact of the transparency regulation is far greater than only these amended acts, because the new rules also affect food domains and food areas that are not formally, well, for which their regulations are not formally amended, but which fall under the umbrella regulation of the general food law, such as, for example, health claims. Health claims falls under the general food law, but the specific regulation on health claims has not been amended because there were no specific parts that needed to be amended. But health claims falls under the general food law, and as such is also affected by the transparency regulation. So the transparency regulation provisions can actually be grouped in 4 pillars. And if you start on the right upper side of the 4 blue boxes, the first pillar is quality and reliability of industry studies. Then if we go clockwise, the second pillar would be transparency of the EU risk assessment in the food chain. The third pillar is on improved risk communication. And the fourth pillar is on the sustainability and governance of the EFSA system. Then I would like to start with the first pillar concerning the quality and reliability of studies. So there are 5 provisions under this pillar. And most of these provisions concern actually the pre-submission phase. So that is the phase before any applicant would submit an application for like a regulatory product substance approval. And these provisions in this pre-submission phase are closely linked with the second pillar concerning the transparency of the EU risk assessment, but I will come to that later on in my presentation. To go back to this first pillar on quality and reliability of studies, this is very much due to the European Citizens Initiative that called for measures to strengthen the quality and reliability of mainly of industry studies that underpin the EU risk assessment. Apparently, it's felt in civil society that there was not enough transparency, especially on industry studies, and they wanted to improve this. So to go into the first provision under this pillar, that's on general pre-submission advice. So under the transparency regulation, EFSA is actually allowed to assist applicants, and most importantly, small and medium-sized enterprises, to provide tailor-made pre-submission advice, which will be given by EFSA staff to the applicant that would request it. And this would then assist the applicants to better understand the specifications of the content of the applications. So it would help them to basically to submit a high-quality dossier. And this can be done, this pre-submission advice can be provided by EFSA staff in all areas where the European Union law provides for the possibility for EFSA to give a scientific output. But it is to be noted that this tailor-made general pre-submission advice will only concern the rules applicable and the content required for a future application. And the advice cannot enter into the design of the studies that should be submitted. And that design of the studies actually remains the responsibility of the applicant. So the EFSA advice cannot say you have to design your study such and such, except if in the law there are already guidelines explaining the design of a study, which is the case in certain sectorial legislations. But in general, the general pre-submission advice should exclude giving any advice on design of studies, because that would remain the responsibility of the applicant. And the whole burden of proof to prove that a certain food product or substance is safe remains also on the applicant. So it's the applicant to submit a full dossier with all the scientific information. And as Frank replied to in one of the previous questions, if this information is not sufficient and there's lack of data in the dossier submitted by the applicant, EFSA will not search themselves for additional information. It will be the applicant who has to prove that this substance is safe. And the applicant has to provide the scientific evidence. Another important point for the general pre-submission advice is that the tailor-made advice that EFSA will provide is without prejudice and non-committal to the future assessment of a corresponding application by the scientific panels of EFSA. So basically, the applicant cannot claim any rights of having had the general pre-submission advice in relation to the outcome of the scientific evaluation of a future potential dossier that he or she will submit. EFSA will provide the advice, which will be sent to the applicant, but a summary of this advice will become public, but only later on in the procedure and only once a corresponding application has been considered valid by EFSA. I will explain you in the next pillar that when a submission has been considered valid by EFSA, it will actually be, the whole dossier will be published except for confidential information. And at that time, also the summary of the pre-submission advice given by EFSA will be made public. And then, in addition to the general pre-submission advice, this is not due to the transparency regulation, but it was already in place since the general food law was initiated in 2002. EFSA also has a task to provide general guidance to applicants and where appropriate general guidance on the design of studies, as I mentioned before, in certain areas. And they have a very comprehensive website where they actually list all the regulated product areas and the regulatory processes, plus all the guidances that are in place and that can help the applicants. Then I move to the second provision under this pillar, which is notification of commissioned studies. And this provision would provide a mechanism by which EFSA would be able to double check whether all studies that are commissioned by an applicant in the context of a future application for an authorization, if these studies have actually been submitted. There was a concern in society that maybe applicants had commissioned certain scientific studies of which the outcomes were not very good for their dossier, and that basically they kind of forget to submit these studies and they only submit studies with positive results that would underpin their case. So with the notification of commissioned studies provision, this would no longer be possible because all food and feed business operators that commission scientific studies with a view to support dossiers for authorization later on, they must notify these studies to EFSA when they commission them. So this is even long before they actually submit a dossier to EFSA for an application. And in addition to the food and feed business operators, also the laboratories in the EU that carry out these studies should notify the studies. The information that should be notified to EFSA by the applicant and by the EU-based laboratories is rather short, but nevertheless very important. So it's the title and the scope of the study commissioned, then the relevant laboratory or testing facility that carries out the study. If it's, of course, the laboratory notifying the study, they are themselves the laboratory carrying out the study, the starting date of the study and the planned completion date. And information about the notifications of these studies will be kept in the database of EFSA. It's not a publicly available database. It's a super confidential database. Only the applicant has the information what was submitted, and EFSA, of course, has access. And member states, in some cases where they are involved in the risk assessment, also have access to the database. But this database otherwise is non-public, and yeah, that's very important to note. But when a corresponding application will be made later on by the applicant, at that moment, the notified information will also be made public. And also very important to note is that during the validation phase of the applications, EFSA will actually check if the applicant has followed this notification of studies obligation. And in case they find incompliances, then there will actually be procedural consequences for the applicant. Because if there's no good justification then provided by the applicant why they did not adhere to the obligation to notify the studies, the actual risk assessment will not start before 6 months. So there will be a delay in the risk assessment deadline. The applicant will have to resubmit the dossier, and then the risk assessment will be delayed intentionally with 6 months. So this is a huge penalty. Then the third provision under this first pillar is public consultation. So there are basically two types of public consultations. There is a consultation at pre-submission phase for renewal applications. And this is actually a public consultation on the planned or the planned studies or the intended studies of the applicant. The applicant will have to notify EFSA of all studies that it intends to carry out for the renewal application. And there they also have to provide the proposed study design. And based on this information, EFSA will then launch a public consultation. They will determine the timelines of the public consultation, but it will be probably like 1 month, as far as I recall. And based on that consultation, EFSA will then provide advice to the applicant, including advice on the study design for the renewals. And similarly to the general advice, this advice is also without prejudice and non-committal to the future assessment of a corresponding renewal application by the scientific panels. Like for the pre-submission advice, a summary of the advice will become available to the public, but only if finally a corresponding application will be made and is considered valid or admissible. Then the second type of public consultation will take place for all new applications. And this would ensure that EFSA, again, has a comprehensive access to all the existing evidence to base its assessment on. And the public consultation will be open to stakeholders and the general public. And this will cover basically all the submitted studies in the dossiers. So this is for new applications, but also the dossiers that are finally submitted for renewal applications. So the renewal applications will have two public consultations. They will have a public consultation on the intended studies that they try to perform still in pre-submission phase. They will get advice. And when they finally make the full application submission for the renewal application, there will be again a public consultation, but on the full package of the studies they submit with the renewal application. So the public consultation on the submission and the submitted studies will take place during the risk assessment process. And therefore, it's also important that in cases of regulated areas where the time for the risk assessment, the legal time for EFSA to do the risk assessment is relatively short, EFSA should have enough time to give due consideration to the results of the public consultation. And if this would create a problem, EFSA can actually put a clock stop for a maximum period of 7 weeks, so that they actually can take into account the results of the public consultation and still finish the risk assessment within the legal timeline. And then I actually will tell you more about this when we go to the second pillar, but I will quickly go to the last two measures under the first pillar. The fourth measure is fact-finding missions to laboratories that carry out studies in the EU and in third countries which have relevant agreements with the EU. And those fact-finding missions should actually take place within 4 years after entry into application of the transparency regulation, which is then that they should be ready by March 2025. And these fact-finding missions carried out by the Commission have the goal to ensure compliance with applicable standards like GLP or ISO standards and so on. These fact-finding missions do not replace the system, the control system that is in place and carried out by member states who are responsible for GLP compliance and so on. But it would give the Commission an overview of what is the status in the EU and in some other countries that have relevant agreements with the EU in laboratories and whether they adhere to the applicable standards. So in case that non-compliance is detected during these fact-finding missions, this will be reported to the European Commission, to the member states, or the member state in which the laboratory is located, and also to EFSA. and of course to the laboratory that is assessed itself, and appropriate follow-up must be ensured. As I mentioned, the member states remain responsible for adherence and compliance with standards. So in this case, it would be like the member state in which the laboratory is located that should follow up with the laboratory in case there's non-compliance with the standard. But it may be that a certain study is used in an ongoing risk assessment, and if non-compliance is detected, then it's up to EFSA to take appropriate measures. And it could, for example, be, but it is up to EFSA again to decide, that EFSA puts a stop the clock in the risk assessment process until the issue is clarified or solved. Then the outcomes of the fact-finding missions overall, so that would be in March 2025, will be presented in an overview report to the Commission. Well, it's from the Commission to the Commission. And then, if appropriate, the Commission may table a legislative proposal to introduce any necessary control procedures, for example, including audits. Then the last provision under this first pillar is verification studies. So currently, and under the General Food Law since 2002, EFSA already had the possibility to commission scientific studies that are necessary for the performance of its mission, not to complement any application dossiers, as Frank explained, but in case of generic mandates where there are lack in data and so on. But under the transparency regulation, there's this new provision of verification studies. And this can be triggered in case of exceptional circumstances of serious controversies or conflicting results, where more assurances are needed to be given to the public that the broadest relevant scientific evidence possible has been taken into account. And to this end, and in those circumstances, the transparency regulation empowers the European Commission as the risk manager to request EFSA to commission additional studies for verification purposes. So I would like to underline that this is a risk management tool for the Commission to ensure the necessary coherence. And that, again, these studies do not replace the studies that should have been provided by the applicant. So in case of an incomplete dossier, lack of data, verification studies are not the tool to be used. It is up to the applicant to provide the burden of evidence to prove that the substance is safe. Then I will move to the second pillar, which is actually the most important pillar of the transparency regulation. So it's on the transparency of EU risk assessment, and more specifically, the transparency of the scientific studies supporting the EU risk assessment. So this pillar builds on the previous measures that were ensuring more independent and transparent EU risk assessment. And this transparency of the EU risk assessment is very important because we believe that a greater transparency of the EU risk assessment process would increase the trust in the EU food system. It would contribute to EFSA acquiring greater legitimacy in pursuing its mission. It would increase the confidence in EFSA's work. And it would also ensure that EFSA is more accountable to the European Union citizens who live in a democratic system. So according to the new rules in the transparency regulation, so all studies and data that are supporting any request for a scientific output by EFSA, so that includes the applications for regulated products, they are to be made publicly available by EFSA proactively and automatically early on in the risk assessment process. And this means that this will be made public when an application is found valid or admissible. So the validation step, as was explained by Frank, it's an administrative process, but it is like the key moment when this whole public disclosure will be launched. So it's a super important step in the timeline. However, the public disclosure will be done with the exception of duly justified confidential information, and I will come back to that. So this proactive disclosure is a significant change from the previous situation before the transparency regulation, because in the past, you could actually only get access to the scientific studies through access to document request upon request. So this was not automatically, it was not proactively, it was only upon request. I would like to stress again that this proactive disclosure of the studies would be done early on in the risk assessment process. And this is very important to ensure public scrutiny of all the dossier and the studies in an effective way before EFSA actually has to deliver its scientific output. Because as mentioned before, these scientific studies will then also be undergoing public consultation. So the studies and data will be made easily accessible in an electronic format through EFSA's website. And Frank also mentioned it, I'm repeating a lot, I noticed, through the open EFSA portal. And this gives them the possibility to search, download, and analyze or assess the information. But it's very important to make clear that the public disclosure will not impinge on any intellectual property rights, which may set up limitations on certain uses of the disclosed documents, nor on any regulatory protection that is set out in EU regulations on, like, for example, the data exclusivity rules that would actually reward the applicants or the institutes with investments. They would reward the investments they have done to perform the scientific studies. So you can actually see the studies, you can analyze them, you can search them, you can download them, but it does not mean that you can actually use the information inside the studies for any purpose that you have. In that respect, the people accessing the studies, they should provide clear undertakings or signed statements that the public disclosure is not meant as a permission to use or exploit the disclosed documents. So that should be very clear. Yeah, and the last point I wanted to make, is on standard data formats. So the transparency regulation also provides the possibility to develop standard data formats by means of implementing acts. So far, this has only been done for the plant protection products area, but it's not to be excluded that in future there may be further standard data formats developed. And I will speed up a little bit because otherwise I run over time, I think. To go to the very important next point on confidentiality. So to ensure the maximum transparency, of course, the EU legislators have not neglected the very important aspect of ensuring the competitiveness of the EU food and feed sector, and specific safeguards for the protection of duly justified confidential information are set out in the regulation. So in particular, the transparency regulation sets out a general positive closed list of information items for which confidential treatment may be requested by the applicant, and it may be granted by EFSA in case verifiable justification has been provided by the applicant. So the confidential the confidential treatment cannot be claimed for anything. It can only be claimed on the items that are listed in this so-called positive list, and only if the applicant can demonstrate that the disclosure of such information would potentially harm its interest to a significant degree. And it's also very important to note that confidentiality can never be claimed for elements that are relevant for the safety of the substance. So, for example, confidentiality treatment may be claimed for elements related to the manufacturing process, or to certain commercial information, or to a quantitative composition of the substance. So all these elements are outlined in the positive list. And to address some sectoral specificities, the general list is further complemented by 7 additional closed positive lists in the sectorial legislation. And that is the GMO directive, the GM food and feed regulation, feed additives regulation, food contact materials, food additives, enzymes and flavorings regulation, plant protection products regulation, and the novel food regulation. And then, not to forget to say that for the confidentiality assessment, are strict deadlines set out, and that is also to ensure that the non-confidential version of the dossier can be disclosed in a timely manner, and this should also not delay the overall risk assessment process. Then there are 2 occasions where even duly justified confidential information may nevertheless be disclosed. And this is in the case where urgent action is essential to protect human health, animal health, or the environment, as defined by the risk manager, or when the information is part of the conclusions of EFSA opinions and relates to foreseeable effects on human health, animal health, or where appropriate, the environment. And these exceptions are not new. They already were applied before the transparency regulation was in place. And the last point is also that the transparency regulation foresees protection of personal data. So any processing of personal data would be carried out in accordance with the applicable union legislation. Then I will move to the third pillar of the transparency regulation, the risk communication. So risk communication, as was already previously explained, is a joint responsibility for risk managers and risk assessors, both at member state and at EU level. So the transparency regulation would ensure a more effective risk communication to address the need for accurate, timely and transparent information on science and also on the decision-making process throughout the whole risk analysis process. So in this respect, the transparency regulation has defined general objectives and general principles, and particular emphasis is placed on the interactive exchange of all interested parties throughout the risk analysis cycle, and especially on the explanation of risk managers' decisions. And it's also interesting to note that one of the identified objectives under the transparency regulation is to contribute to the fight against so-called fake news in the area of the food chain. And based on these objectives and general principles, the Commission will adopt, by means of an implementing act, a general plan on risk communication. And this should be following consultations with EFSA and the member states. And the general plan actually aims to identify the key factors to be taken into account when considering the type and level of risk communication activities needed, to identify the different types and levels of risk communication activities and the appropriate tools and channels to be used, also taking into account the target audiences. The general plan would establish appropriate mechanisms of coordination and cooperation to strengthen the coherence of risk communication amongst risk assessors and risk managers. And finally, it would also establish appropriate mechanisms to ensure an open dialogue amongst consumers, food and feed business operators, the academic community, and all interested parties. There's no legal deadline for this risk communication general plan. I can tell you that a lot of preparatory work has been undertaken, in particular by EFSA, on certain elements related to this general plan, and EFSA have, as usual, published all this information and reports on their website. I forgot to put the link on the website, but if you Google risk communication and EFSA, I'm sure you will immediately find all the very interesting and comprehensive documents and reports that they have produced. Then I will end with the fourth pillar of the transparency regulation on EFSA sustainability and governance. And the new rules would strengthen the sustainability and governance of the EFSA system, which was very nicely explained by Frank in the previous presentation. So the transparency regulation actually changed the setup of the management board composition. So under the general food law that was adopted in 2002, and that was in the aftermath of several food crises in the late 90s, early 2000s, at that time, a deliberate choice was made not to involve representatives of member states in the EFSA management board. So they wanted to keep the management board as independent as possible, and all the members were participating on their individual capacity. And accordingly, at that time, EFSA's management board consisted of 14 members that were appointed by the Council based on a list drawn up by the Commission, plus a representative of the Commission. But since then, the situation and the circumstances have evolved over time. And currently, there's a driver for all EU decentralized agencies, and EFSA is one of the EU decentralized agencies, to follow a common approach to set up management boards and to involve member states representatives in the management boards of the agencies. And as a result, since 1st of July 2022, so that's only 2 months ago now, the new EFSA management board consists of representatives of all 27 member states. And this should then ensure a greater involvement of the member states in the governance of EFSA. And in addition to the member states representatives, the management board also consists of 2 representatives of the Commission, which at present it's a representative of DG Santé and another representative of DG Agri, the agricultural DG. It also consists of 2 members appointed by the European Parliament and 4 members representing civil society and food chain interests. And these 4 members actually represent consumer organization, environmental non-governmental organizations, farmer organizations, and industry organizations. So one member for each food chain interest group. In addition to the changed management board composition, the member states will also have a more active involvement to stimulate experts in contributing to EFSA's work. As I mentioned before, EFSA is always looking for more very good experts to work with. And to help EFSA finding more experts and to be more sustainable on a long term, member states are now also obliged to promote through a number of activities EFSA's calls for experts to the scientific panels and the scientific committee to ensure that basically as many good candidates as possible respond to the call and to increase the overall pool of experts that EFSA can work with. And for all experts, but also the management board members, of course, the criteria of excellence and independence must be respected. It was also mentioned, I think, by Frank before. I'm repeating again a lot of things, but indeed EFSA's independence is very important, and the strict criteria of independence continue to apply. And the last point I wanted to make related to this, the EFSA sustainability and governance, is that the transparency regulation also reinforces EFSA's own scientific capacity and strengthens the scientific cooperation with national scientific organizations. So EFSA has the intention indeed to create more partnerships with member states and with scientific organizations, and they have budget available to do that, to be more hands-on and operational and have a bigger scientific pool. Then to summarize a little bit the key dates and also the budget that was linked to the transparency regulation. So it was published, the transparency regulation, on the 6th of September 2019. It entered into application 18 months after that publication date on the 27th of March 2021, with the exception of the provision for the new EFSA management board and the appointment of experts in panels, which entered into application on the 1st of July of this year. It's also important to note that the new rules under the transparency regulation will not apply to requests for scientific outputs that were submitted to EFSA before 27 March 2021. And lastly, when the Commission made the proposal for the transparency regulation, we also proposed a budget increase because EFSA would get a lot of additional tasks. And therefore, and this budget proposal was also approved and adopted, EFSA has now received an additional 62.5 million euros and 106 additional posts. And it's important to note that a large part of this budget increase actually aims at stimulating member states' engagement in EFSA's scientific activities. And it can be used to reward experts' contribution, increase EFSA grants, and so on. So it's not only EFSA getting the money, but a big part of the money would flow back either to member states or member states organizations or organizations who apply for tenders and grants by EFSA. Then to come to the implementation, so the regulation was adopted on 27 March 2021. Then it had to be implemented. So we together, the Commission and EFSA set up a comprehensive implementation plan that was carried out in close cooperation over several years. And I will quickly summarize some key implementation actions that have been carried out in the period until the entry into application of the regulation. So very importantly to notice that besides the regulation itself and the sectorial regulations that were amended accordingly, EFSA also adopted so-called practical arrangements for the implementation of the transparency regulation. And these practical arrangements are also legally binding rules. They adopted these practical arrangements in 4 sets. So there are practical arrangements on the pre-submission phase. So that would include the general pre-submission advice, the notification of the Commission studies, and the public consultations. Then there are practical arrangements for the transparency and confidentiality parts of the transparency regulation. There are practical arrangements specifically on access to documents and AHUS regulation, and there are practical arrangements adopted for the consistency of confidentiality assessments in the area of plant protection products, because there's also a huge involvement of the member states in the risk assessment process. So now there are also legally binding rules to make the system between EFSA, the member states, more coherent. And all these practical arrangements are published on EFSA's website, together with also a comprehensive Q&A document with answers already many questions. And that is all to be found under the link that I provided on the slide. Then in addition to the practical arrangements, which are legally binding documents, EFSA also updated a lot of its scientific and administrative guidance documents to reflect the new provisions introduced by the transparency regulation. And also the Commission actually created 1 new guidance document on the deliberate release into the environment of genetically modified organisms. And we also aligned a working document on the procedure for application of basic substances. And we also adapted and aligned the practical guidance for applicants on the submission of food additives, enzymes, and food flavorings. The Commission then also aligned 7 of its implementing acts to align them to the new transparency rules. They're listed on the slide. So they were in the areas of novel food, food additives, feed additives, plant protection products, additional vitamins and minerals, and other substances to food. And then there was also a very important need to ensure that there was an appropriate IT infrastructure available to ensure especially the public disclosure of all the documents, because all the documents that would be disclosed should be, according to the regulation, downloadable, printable, and electronically searchable. And in the past, some applications arrived on a CD-ROM or on paper or I don't know which format, and this would never be sufficient to comply with transparency regulation. So together with the EFSA colleagues, the Commission and EFSA have again worked very closely together to set up an IT system. And as a result, we now have an electronic submission system, which is called Electronic Submission Food Chain Platform, which is a web-based application that applicants can use to create, submit, and manage their applications in most of the regulated product areas, except for plant protection products and MRL applications, for which there's another system that already existed. It's called Euclid. And Euclid stands for the International Uniform Chemical Information Database. And this Euclid system has been adapted to specifically comply with transparency regulation for the plant protection products and MRL submissions. And for all these IT tools, there are training and support materials available on the website. So I've provided the web link to the DG Santé page and to the EFSA page, and you'll find all kind of videos, tutorials, and so on. And I think this is already my last slide. It's just summarizing some important links in case you want to find more information. So please have a look, and I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.